Today we are presenting about racial injustice in the criminal justice system of the United States. And in this collage, you can see people who have died because of racial injustice. So starting off with history of racism, slavery was a big issue regarding racism, and it led to the buying and selling of many African Americans who were forced into harsh labor conditions and were not allowed an education or freedom. But with slavery came resistance, leading to the Civil War, which divided the nation into two parts, one for slavery and one against slavery. At the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in the rebellious states free. But racism did not end with slavery, and a new issue, segregation, was formed. Segregation was public places were either for whites or for people of color, so restaurants, schools, and businesses were segregated. Many civil rights activists rose to fame because of their efforts to bring equality. Rosa Parks was one woman who denied her seat on the bus to a white man and was arrested for it. Another famous activist was Martin Luther King Jr., who delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, allowing fair employment for all people and ending segregation in public places.
Okay, so racial profiling is the practice by police officers in which they target individuals based on their race, ethnicity, and religion. So basically they target them based on their appearance. After the 9/11 attacks in 2001, racial profiling increased greatly for Arab Americans. And this is partly due to the special registration that was implemented, where 80,000 Arab American males had to provide the government with information about themselves, fingerprints, and stuff like that. Another big part of racial profiling is that minorities are more likely to be arrested and searched when stopped by police officers than whites are, despite the fact that whites have the same amount of likeliness to have contraband on them. And then from the perspective of a police officer, Reddit Hudson wrote an article for the Washington Post talking about his experience in the St. Louis Police Department, and he found the criminal justice system to be profoundly corrupt. And yeah.
Okay, so starting off with the bias towards police officers, the police have advantages in court. So Michael Harriot, the founder of the Black Ones podcast, says that police are 33% less likely to be convicted of a crime than a regular citizen because the testimonies that they produce are based on their subjective views and what they thought was right when they actually committed this proposed crime. So this leads to belittlement of crimes committed by police officers. Next. Okay, so police brutality is the use of excessive force against citizens, and it is often it's often believed that white people are more targeted by police than black people, which is false. 49% of people shot by the police were white, while making up 62% of the total United States population. However, 24% of those same people shot by the police were black, making up 13% of the United States population, showing that black people are 2.5 times more likely to get shot by police than white people are, and that is due to racial profiling. Two instances of police brutality is the case of Sandra Bland, who was stopped for not turning on her turn signal, but the Officer Brian T. and Trooper Brian T. Insignia actually arrested her and forced her out of her car because she had not put out a lit cigarette. And the rules he followed were actually broken, and he did not follow the rules set by the Texas Department of Public Safety that were implemented a couple months earlier. Alton Sterling suffered through racial profiling. He was standing outside of a convenience store and selling cigarettes when the police came up to him and confronted him, and when he asked what he had done wrong, the police shot him 6 times, but the convenience store owner said that the police indicated that in Alton Sterling's back pocket there was a gun after they had shot him, which shows that Sterling never actually confronted the police with the gun, which would give them an unreasonable motive to shoot him.
As we move on to racism in the courtroom, one major court case is the Rodriguez-Pena versus Colorado. Rodriguez-Pena versus Colorado, a Hispanic man, groped 2 teenage women in a barn in a darkened restroom. At trial, the judge and the jury were not able to find the large-scale crime of the attacker, but found 2 small felonies. After trial, the Hispanic man had an alibi saying that he was in another barn, and after trial, 2 of the jurors said that since both both Rodriguez Pena and his alibi were both Hispanic, the jury had Hispanic beliefs towards them and had bias. So, and then another court case is Batson versus Kentucky. It was an African American. He stole a receipt of stolen goods, and during Batson versus Kentucky, Batson was tried for just in possession and for stealing. And when Batson and in the prosecutor tried to remove all 4 African Americans from the jury pool, but that violated the 6th and the 14th Amendment, which Thurgood Marshall, the head judge, said that basically saying that racism will stop for now, but eventually it will be a continuous problem. And lastly is the use of marijuana. African Americans are 2/3 more likely to get caught in possession of marijuana and 4 times as likely to receive a longer death sentence than a white person, and even though they both use the same amount in possession of marijuana.
So some of the effects of racial injustices that were previously mentioned are the deaths of unarmed African Americans at the hands of the police. So one example would be Trayvon Martin, who died after being confronted by George Zimmerman. He was unarmed, and George Zimmerman still chose to shoot him and kill him. His death sparked many protests in which protesters would chant things like, "I am Trayvon Martin." His death caused major gained national attention, in which professional athletes, celebrities, and even then President Barack Obama, who would go on to deliver an emotional speech to Martin's parents saying, "If I had a son, he would look like Trayvon." His death also prompted the creation of the hashtag Black Lives Matter, which would be used in later deaths, such as Eric Garner, who died in Staten Island after being held in an illegal chokehold for several minutes and was killed. His death also sparked many protests in which activists would chant, "I can't breathe," which was what Garner told the police officer when he was being held in chokehold, and prompted die-ins in which activists would lie on the ground for several minutes like Garner had. The final example is Freddie Gray, whose infamous story began when he made eye contact with the police officer and began to run. When he was arrested and apprehended, he was placed in the police van but wasn't properly restrained, which caused him to obtain a fatal spine injury on the way to the police station. His death was due to the negligence of the police officer to restrain him and properly provide help. His death also prompted the Department of Justice to investigate the Baltimore Police Department to see if they were biased when encountering people of color.
Okay, so we found a couple solutions. So the first one is to bring more awareness to the issue of racism and injustice in the United States, because there are people who understand that it's a problem, but there are also people who don't recognize and accept that it is an issue in society. And we also want to dismantle the idea that it's non-existent. And we believe that these 2 solutions must be done before any other changes or actions can be made.
So some limitations to our solution include that racism has been systematically present throughout the history of the United States and before the United States was even created. So it's going to be harder to implement the idea that racism does exist and to overthrow it, because so many people have been believing for hundreds of years that it doesn't exist and that they are in fact right. It is also seen, but police brutality and racial profiling is seen as fair treatment towards people of color, because of the idea that racism has been implemented throughout our history, and it's hard to get rid of that when it's been so present.
So, through our findings, it is evident that racism exists in the criminal justice system of the United States, and that racial injustice is a major issue that needs to be faced by today's society. Thank you.
All right, guys. So I'll start from left to right. So Rex, describe how the content of the team presentation was changed as a result of group discussion.
As we discussed more and more in depth, we had different biases since within the group. So some people had their beliefs and some people had other ideas. And so we just basically mix and matched and try to combine all our ideas to get one collective solution.
Okay. How did the group decide to include, let's say, Sal's perspective in the overall presentation?
We decided to include it so that we could, enhance the audience, and that if we could create like sympathy towards the people of color, and that we could connect more with the audience, because racism happens every day, and we wanted to make sure that everybody could connect to it when making our presentation.
Okay. Reflecting on your teammates' work, which one had the greatest impact on your overall understanding of the problem your group identified for you?
I think Sally's research had the greatest impact because she included like a lot of statistics, which I think helped us understand better like the entire topic. And a lot of her information was like in depth and had multiple perspectives, which helped us to come to our conclusion.
Okay. Describe an argument from one of your peers' individual reports that made you think differently about your team's solution or conclusion.
Well, I'd have to say an argument on Sally's portion of the project where she argued that police are given the benefit of the doubt in court because of their acting on what they think is right. And it really made us think about an overall solution and how the police are given the benefit of the doubt, and that's going to make it a big problem when, like in racial injustice cases, because something could have been racist, but if the police thought it was the correct thing to do, then the judge would believe them.
Okay. In the future, what change would you make to your group norms, and how would you expect that to improve your team presentation?
I would definitely set deadlines so that everything would be organized and we would have more time to practice and more time to edit our information. And as for the actual presentation, probably include more lenses such as economic lenses if there could be any possible to find.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.